And welcome back to the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out every single week. It is time for my annual winners and losers segment, looking back on the European season and the teams that should feel the best about how things went and the teams that should be the most disappointed. Winner number one, surprise, surprise, Napoli. Napoli won Serie A by 16 points without trying for the final month of the season. They didn't just win the league, which in and of itself would have been made them one of these three winners and been historic for how long it had been one of the stories of the season. It would be the story had Manchester City not won the treble, but they did it by making the rest of the league look bad, which makes them even more of a winner. And they did it in a season that was supposed to be a transition. It is so easy to forget where this team started back in August. Dries Mertens, Lorenzo Insigne, Kalidou Koulibaly. Three legends of the club. And still, to varying degrees, but important players. All gone. They didn't even rebuild. They tore it down and built something better in essentially one transfer window. And I know not every key contributor to this team was acquired in this one transfer window, but it's remarkable what they did. And I continue to go back to the point that they're going to lose players. Osimhen might be gone this summer. But to be able to identify replacements for the players that they have lost and to build a team that is getting contributions from so many players allows you to survive losing the players who are ultimately going to leave. To me, it's the pinnacle in the sense that nobody can expect them to have another season like this. And you can't expect them to go replace these players the same way they did the previous version. But from a Napoli era standpoint, to me, this can absolutely be the beginning rather than the end. Does that mean they're competing for a Serie A title every season? Not necessarily. But you can consistently be in the Champions League. Maybe make a Champions League run out of it. And also, there just isn't anybody that scares you in this league. They're going to be up there even if they lose a piece or two. Does that mean they can, again, I'm not convinced they can replicate it or make it any better than this season. But there's every chance they can go back and be a top 2 team in the league, top 10 team in the world, that kind of thing. But really, this is just about them making the rest of the league look bad and kind of propping Serie A up for most of the season. They are the winner, full stop, of the season, in my opinion. Loser number one, unsurprisingly, Chelsea. The managerial changes didn't work. Frank Lampard's reputation is in tatters. But more than that, you have a very troubling combination that was the end result of this season. And this is the biggest reason out of the many reasons to choose from why they're the biggest loser for me. This team didn't qualify for a European competition. Think about how many players are not expecting to just be part of the squad, but expecting to be starters regularly next season. You don't pay all the money they paid for all of these guys and then have them be content sitting on the bench. They need to make deep runs in both domestic cups to have any chance of giving guys the playing time they want. And even then, I don't think they can. And to me, that is the question with Mauricio Pochettino. And I wrote about this in my 5 things from the week. I don't have any questions about him and his ability to work with and develop these kind of young players that Chelsea have brought in. That is exactly what he did at Tottenham. He is excellent at it. My concern is these are not the same kind of guys he was working with at Spurs. These aren't Harry Kane, who was on a couple, loans to random championship teams and nobody really expected anything from. These are the highest profile young players in the world. And this is an owner who has already fired Thomas Tuchel and Graham Potter and will be on manager number 4 once Pochettino actually manages a game. Is Poch going to get the time he needs? Because this is it's a dumpster fire. Now, it's one that could be put out very quickly. But you have got to come into this expecting that it's going to take time. If you want all of these young players who are clearly not where they need to be to develop, you have to take the lumps along the way and actually pick a manager to stick with. Poch is as good a choice as anybody. And the second part of that equation is these players need to buy into what Poch is selling because he is a terrific motivator, terrific man manager for a specific type of player. I would argue his group at Chelsea is closer to the one at PSG. That didn't go very well. The egos became a problem. Now, again, we're not talking about Neymar and Mbappe here. But these are players who feel entitled because Chelsea sent the message that they were entitled. And now you have too many of them where they're all battling with each other because there isn't enough playing time. There aren't enough spots in the 11. Keeping all of them happy and focused is going to be a tremendous challenge. So my theme for Chelsea next season and just moving forward is that Poch can do this and get Chelsea to where Chelsea expect to be. But everybody has to let him. That means Todd Boehly. That means the players. A lot of this is out of his control. Because you can't just snap your fingers and fix this stuff. If you could, one of these guys who managed this team would have been able to figure it out. It goes beyond just the embarrassment of the season with all of the money spent. It's also about the situation you now find yourself in where you have this super expensive squad that is way too big with a bunch of guys who are unhappy, trying to figure out who's going to get sold, who's not. And it's just not a sustainable way to operate. And to me, if you want to get the most out of these young guys, Poch is a terrific choice. That part of it makes sense. It's just a question of whether this turns into more like the Spurs situation, where everybody gets behind him, or more like the PSG situation, where he was just never able to build those relationships the way he needed to and connect with those guys to get them to be invested in what he was trying to do. He's capable. Everybody has to let him actually get the most out of this team, though. Winner number 2, Lens. Didn't talk about him very much this season. They weren't in European competition. They came close in the end to catching PSG, but it was kind of a series of events that unfolded. They were always within striking distance, but never really threatening. And they ended the season on this incredible winning streak. And so they closed the gap, but it was still over with a game to spare, all of that kind of stuff. That's not why they're here, though. They're here, though, because not only was this club, recently not even in Ligue 1, they haven't played in the Champions League in 20 years. They haven't played in European competition in 15, if I did the math right. It's remarkable. And it's one of those stories that would have gotten more attention if you didn't have the title race in the Bundesliga, and you didn't have Napoli, and you didn't have Arsenal, and you didn't have the treble. And you didn't have all the drama with PSG this season. And you didn't have Union Berlin doing something similar in the Bundesliga. It's just the unfortunate reality of being the fifth league. But this is Lens team who have been good since they came back up and obviously took it to a whole nother level this season. The big question going into next season will be if you can keep Lois Openda. He was sensational. I think it was 21 goals he scored in Ligue 1. I could have that number slightly off. That is kind of your tipping point in terms of, I mean, he's going to go eventually. He's one of the most promising young strikers in Europe at this point. But it's that interesting situation where you also are providing the opportunity to play in the Champions League. Now, of course, there are plenty of other clubs who could also offer him that opportunity, but you're not in a rush to make that sale because you're still on the upward trajectory. You haven't gotten the fruits of your labor this season yet. And if you're going to the Champions League, you want your really, really good striker to stay. And so that's going to be an interesting thing to monitor. Regardless, they're in a really good spot. This is also one of those things, though, where, you know, how much can you hold on to? Not only how much of this team can you hold on to, but can you sustain it year after year? Because what we've seen a lot from the other Ligue 1 teams, not named Marseille, and I guess primarily Lyon to a certain extent, when you think of kind of the other really exciting Ligue 1 teams that have gotten into the Champions League, that Monaco team, that Stade Rennes team, they kind of got dismantled immediately and the club was never the same. Can Lens avoid that happening? You're going to lose pieces along the way at some point, whether that's this summer or later on. But can you back it up? Can you deal with the added games? All of that kind of stuff. Because this was just quite simply one of the best seasons in club history. Not the best, but pretty close. Loser number 2, going back to the Premier League with Tottenham. There are just very few positives to point to. I mean, you're not playing in European competition. Again, multiple managers dismissed. Cups didn't go particularly great. Congratulations, you got to the knockout stage of the Champions League and then didn't do anything. Right, even Chelsea had a Champions League run to point to. Spurs didn't even really have that. And by the way, they almost didn't even get out of the group. And it was a group that they should have won with ease. Then you got the Harry Kane stuff. But more than any of that, this season was a reminder and made it clear that they are as far as they have been from reaching the heights that Mauricio Pochettino led them to. Because I always tried to trick myself into believing they're kind of one step away and they have the squad to do it. And they have the manager to do it, whether that was Mourinho or specifically Antonio Conte. And it's clear that that was just incorrect. And it has just continued to get worse and worse to the point where they're not even getting into the Champions League. They're no longer in Europe because they're getting exposed by the Newcastles and Brightons of this world who are just running better operations. I talked about the hiring of Ange Postecoglou last week. Go check out that video if you haven't seen it already. I'm all in on it. But it's time to reset expectations. I'm not falling for this anymore. And that's whether Harry Kane stays or leaves. They are falling behind everybody else. And so to me, this is what I talked about with Postecoglou. It's not about trying to make the Champions League. It's not about trying to somehow get to this level that was supposed to be the next evolution where you're competing for Premier League titles. It's not even about winning a trophy. It's about getting your fans back on board and getting people to believe in your team again. Because everybody, and playing in a way that actually gets Spurs fans excited. Because everybody was just so over this whole Mourinho, Conte, Nuno era. That's the first part. Then you can actually get to the trying to win trophies, trying to build. But they've even lost the kind of the heart and soul aspect, which is the downside to hiring guys like Mourinho and Conte when it doesn't go well. And so that's where I kind of left this season thinking about, is you got to rebuild this thing kind of from the ground up. Not necessarily from a squad standpoint. Obviously, they need improvements there too. But just from a club identity standpoint. Get back to who you are and this quote-unquote Spurs DNA that Daniel Levy talked about and then never did anything to back up. Get fans excited again and feeling like there's something to cheer for. And Postecoglou can give you all of that. Get the players confident again. But that doesn't get you to where Spurs expect to be. And at the same time, that's what has to happen first before you can even start thinking about that other stuff. Staying in England for my final winner, I cheated a little bit and just made it the top 4 in the Premier League. And even then, I felt a little bit bad because Brighton and Aston Villa deserve honorable mentions here. So I'm going to talk about them briefly first. I mean, Brighton, it's the best season in club history. Aston Villa, to me, Unai Emery is the manager of the season. To get back into Europe with where they were, absolutely remarkable. So, honorable mention to those two. But then you look at the top 4 itself. Because I originally had Arsenal, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized it just needs to be all 4 of these teams. I mean, I was not going to put Manchester City because I only have 3, but they did win a treble, and they did finally win the Champions League. They're pretty big winners. The other 3 are more who I want to talk about, though. For Arsenal, I will say this one more time. You can call it choking or throwing the Premier League title away. You can be disappointed that things went the way they did. Although I find it odd that you can simultaneously talk about City's inevitability and that, but that's a different conversation. What you can't do is call this season a failure. Failures are related to expectations. If you would have told Arsenal fans you would have been back in the Champions League comfortably, looking like legitimate title challengers, with a young, promising group of players who are really easy to get behind and who feel like they have a real connection to this club, taking it 100 times out of 100. Therefore, Arsenal is a massive winner this season. And also just taking that step from Champions League hopeful to clearly one of the teams at the top of the Premier League pecking order moving forward. Does that mean they're ever going to win a Premier League and that, you know, this young group is going to get better and eventually 2-3 years they're going to find a way to knock off Manchester City? Not necessarily. There's an argument that's going to be the best from a point standpoint, from a performance standpoint, the best it's going to get. Just because of how difficult it is to stay with the top teams in this league. I'm not entirely convinced that will be the case, but it's one of those situations where progress is not going to be linear. At the same time, though, you know you already have this team that should easily qualify for the Champions League, that should easily reach the knockout stage of the Champions League, and now you're talking about who can you add to it. When you get this kind of progress and these kind of results, it adds that ambition and convinces the Kroenkes to go say, okay, we're close. When we spend money, we actually get results for it. There's a benefit that you can see. There is improvement. So let's go get a Declan Rice. Going to have to actually see who ends up signing before start making sweeping declarations about Arsenal's transfer window. But right? There's the excitement, there's the buzz, there's the belief that this is a terrific team. And players want to be here, which makes it appealing for somebody like Declan Rice to be with all these guys he's also with on the England team. And you don't see any of them going anywhere. Ramsdale, Saka, Odegaard. That is all stuff that nobody would have believed at the end of last season. And 12 months later, here we are. Then Manchester United. A strange season, up and down season. Again, I wouldn't have individually made them a winner. I would have put at least two of these three other teams ahead of them. But they fit the category that I'm going for here. They found a manager, they won a trophy. Again, if you would have laid that part out after those first two games of the Premier League season, I certainly wouldn't have believed you. I don't think many other people would have either. And oh, by the way, they made the final of another cup too. Massive step forward. Again, it's not where they want to be, where they expect to be. There are holes in that squad that need to be addressed. But you take it every single time. And Erik ten Hag, to me, is the guy. And that was one of the biggest parts of this is, and I guess this is how I'll summarize it. There were these teases that United were back, but it never really carried over. It was 7 games, and then they had that terrible stretch again, right? The Ole at the wheel, kind of up and down roller coaster. And yes, this season had some roller coaster elements to it. But to me, it's very clear that Manchester United are back. That this is real. They were too good for too long, too much of the season. Not perfect, not at Manchester City or Arsenal's level, but back to where they are a factor where you go into seasons expecting them to be top 4. Not, I can talk myself into them finishing 6th because I just don't really believe this in their United. This is a different conversation. Ten Hag has done the hardest part, which is changing that culture and changing the vibe around the club, right? All the stuff that Spurs need to fix right now. That was United before Ten Hag. Now you're talking about what can we do to get this team to the next level? That's an exciting place to be. And then, of course, Newcastle. It's another one of those weird spots where I don't have too much to say about the ownership part of this. It's concerning, it's problematic, it needs to be part of the story. I just don't know how to analyze it any further than that. What I can talk about is that Newcastle now have this combination of money, as concerning as that money is, and a manager. Because the story here is both. I said coming into this season, I believed what happened under Eddie Howe at the end of last year was real. It just baffles me that this guy is not viewed as one of the best managers in the Premier League and somehow kind of lost his reputation because Bournemouth eventually got relegated. The one time kind of everything went badly for them. And at the same time, he now has, and this is why to me he was the perfect guy for this job. Again, whether, the questions about the money aside, you give him those kind of financial resources with his coaching ability, and this was going to be the end result. He is getting the most out of, and this is probably oversold to a certain extent, but it is important to recognize that it's not like he has a group of superstars out there. He got a couple really good players from the transfer market. Bruno Guimaraes, Sven Botman. They were able to add Nick Pope, who was really good in net. Obviously, Kieran Trippier. But you still got a lot of Joe Linton's, Callum Wilson's, Sean Longstaff's, Miguel Almiron's, Jacob Murphy's, Dan Burns. And this team's playing in the Champions League next season. You don't look at that team and say that's one of the 4 best squads in the Premier League. No way. But they got the money to give themselves the opportunity, and then they got the manager who's actually going to elevate those players. And the combination worked perfectly. And so now comes the next part where it gets even more uncomfortable, which is now that they have Champions League money, now that this is working even faster than anybody thought, what happens next? You're hearing James Maddison. You're hearing Nicolo Barella. And now all of a sudden you're talking about something on a whole nother level where it's getting closer to that Manchester City conversation of, look, other teams just can't do this. But they're not there yet. I don't think anybody's particularly intimidated by this current squad. Got some really good players in there, but also have a lot of players who are getting elevated and playing their best thanks to Eddie Howe. But ultimately it comes down to this. For better or for worse, and certainly I would argue for worse, it's a Big 7. You cannot have a conversation about the Big 6 and then leave Newcastle out at this point. That's what this season showed. Because they are, with the help of new ownership, I mean, they're past Spurs, still not past United, Arsenal, and Chelsea is kind of a difficult situation. But, you know, they're not past United, they're not past Arsenal, they're not past City. They're certainly in a better spot than Spurs, and right now they're in a better spot than Chelsea. It's not just that they're one of the hopefuls to try and get those Europa League spots or something. They are here just like everybody expected them to be once that ownership change got made. But they are here now. That's what this season showed, and so they are a winner. Finally, going back to Italy to round out with loser number 3, Juventus. Had some different options here. But the more I thought about it, the more I really decided Juventus was the right choice. Even without the points deduction, they would have come in 4th with 0 trophies. So this is not just about the points deduction, although it is certainly partially about the points deduction. The way it was handled with the applying it, taking it back, then adding the new one right at the end of the season, the uncertainty that came with that. It was just not a fun season for Juventus. That's part of this. But then there's the other parts too. 5 Italian clubs won a trophy, played in a European final, or reached the semifinals of the Champions League this season. Napoli won the league. Inter Milan won the other 2 domestic trophies and reached the Champions League final. AC Milan reached the Champions League semis. Roma played in the Europa League final. Fiorentina played in the Conference League final. None of those teams were Juventus. Juventus also had the Europa League open up for them when Sevilla knocked off Manchester United. And they couldn't get past Sevilla, who then went on to win the tournament. That would have put them in the Champions League rather than the Conference League. And all of this goes back to the biggest point of all, which I've kind of mentioned with Napoli, but it specifically applies to Juventus and kind of the reverse. Nobody is scared of them right now, which is incredible to think about considering where we were, 5 years ago, when they had a stranglehold on the league. And it started with that Pirlo decision, and it's just kind of gone downhill from there. They are another team trying to make the Champions League at this point. And you like their chances too. Again, they would have this season. It would have been close, but they would have without the punishment. But even think about how their Champions League campaign went. It was embarrassing. There is just nothing, if you're Inter, if you're AC Milan, if you're Napoli, if you're Lazio, if you're Roma, if you're Atalanta, there's just nothing scary about Juventus. And that's why I felt so strongly they had to be a loser here. They're just another one of the top teams in Italy. And this season was proof of that. You know, they found themselves in the Europa League. Couldn't even win that. They were just in the top four battle. Were never title contenders. Had some good, had some bad. Bad Champions League campaign. This is just who they are right now. And it's hard to see it changing in the short term, even if everything in terms of the punishments is normal. It's not like that cost them a league title or something. They're just another good Italian team that sometimes will have better seasons than others, it feels like. And you look at that squad and you just don't see that many players that really, really impress you. Like past teams. You know, there aren't many superstars there. The best players in Serie A don't play for Juventus. They play for Napoli. Could argue they play for Lazio. They play for AC Milan in the case of Rafa Leao and Theo Hernandez. They play for Inter in the case of, your Barellas, Lautaro Martinez, etc. That's where Juventus are. That's why they're one of my losers.